Welcome to the Oracle Mobile Application Framework YouTube channel. In this episode, I talk about preferences, user preferences, and it's intentionally put into a series of recordings that we talk about device integration, because preferences typically sit on the device. Yes, I know, you do have an option to have users filling preferences and save them on a remote server so that you could share preferences across devices, but that's not the point. The point really is that users can specify specific behavior of their application for a specific device, and they should be able to leverage that functionality either offline or online. So for that, it's a device integration topic, and we cover it here. No matter how good you design a feature, believe it or not, you will always find someone who wants to switch it off. And to allow people to switch it off has the benefit that you gain loyalty to your application, because people are more loyal to your application if they feel happy with the application. So the more preferences you can provide for them to tailor the application to what they think is an optimal user experience, the more likely is they will stick with your application. You would think that in an enterprise environment loyalty doesn't matter. Well, in fact it does, as it always did. Usability is key in all of the aspects of application development, and it's even more key in mobile application development. So you, as an enterprise application developer who builds application for employees, you cannot really rely on employees just being happy only because you expose their business application to the mobile device. They do have requirements and they know what other applications can do, and you have to keep up with that. However, MAF will help you, and I show you how MAF can do that for you. First of all, user preferences are everything that users can configure. So you can expose a specific set of selections for the user to influence the behavior of an application. And for the use cases, and I will show you just a few of the use cases, you can use that as a feature to personalize the user interface or personalize the behavior. So that could be showing or hiding images. Now, if the user wants to get rid of some of the images to have more real estate available for the data that the user is interested in, you can provide that option. If the user is on a slow network connection, you can give him the preference option to avoid images being streamed from a server, just to reduce the data load. Or you can have the user specifying the number of rows they want to see. Now, in an order entry system, you may want to see 5 orders on a display, and then you scroll to the next 5. Or others will prefer to see 10. Now you can make that options available, or as just a declarative option in MAF anyway, and I will show you later on how that works. You can provide preferences for users to provide end-user licenses. Maybe you have an application you built where part of the application is free and the other part is a paid functionality. Now here you could have a preference, which is a license key, which you know from a lot of software vendors. You provide the license, and then whenever the feature starts, it would check the license key, evaluates this, and if it's a valid license key, then the user can use that functionality. Otherwise, you would just hide it. Or you can, in a more advanced enterprise employee use case, you can provide information for the user about proxy settings and configuration settings to remote servers from where they can query web services or from where they can query upload functionalities, like for instance refreshes of the configuration settings. Now, a user who is working in an enterprise should be able to respond to an email that they receive to set these preferences, so you don't have to revisit all of their devices. So that is what you can do with preferences, and there are definitely a lot more use cases than that, but these 3 just will give an idea of what preferences could do for you. What I want to talk about in the next minutes is application preferences and feature preferences, just for you to understand what that is in MAF and what the differences are. I will show you, and that's I guess the key of this talk here, how to access the preferences from your application, from your logic in your application, and how to do this from expression language and from Java, as when you work with AMX, then Java is your programming language. And then I have another section where I talk about shared properties. Now, if you're familiar with MAF, you know that MAF is built out of features that you assemble into a mobile application, and each of the feature runs in its own isolated environment as it's meant to be a unit of reuse. However, what if there's a setting a user does in one of the features that you want to make available to other features as well? And I'll show you a very simple strategy for that. So let's start with application preferences. Now, application preferences, well, I called it application preferences only because it's configured in the MAF application XML file, which is a global configuration file in MAF. You can also call this global preferences. In fact, these preferences are available to all features. Now, all features will see that preference and can work with that preference. The way that you create it, you would just go to the MAF application XML file, just double click on that, it opens up the dialog, and then you can start composing preferences by just clicking on this green plus icon that you see on that screenshot. It will open up a dialog, and here you will learn about nesting. Now, preferences are added into groups, so you can have groups of preferences, but you can also have subpages, as we will see later. Anyway, you start with a group, you just give it a name, and then you continue working. For each of the groups, you can now put in preference items. Now, these preference items could be on a separate page, in which case you would add a preference page. So that will then at runtime show as a menu item. You click on that in the preferences and will navigate to the next page. It all helps you to partition or categorize preferences so the user has it easier to use. So you could have a separate page just for display preferences, you could have a separate page for data preferences, you can have a separate page for configuration preferences, for example. Each of the preferences has an ID. Now, this is what internally you would use in your application programming, and it has a name, a label, which is what the user sees. You could have different items that you define, and now the items are either the child of a group or the child on a page, where actually the page also needs to have a group set to hold the childs. And the options that you have are to define a Boolean setting. Now, this Boolean setting, that would be like show images true, false. You set a default setting, and this will show at runtime as a switch. And depending on the operation system you're on, the switch will render accordingly. Or it could be a number, like the example I gave about the fetch size or the number of items to show on the screen, like just give me 5 orders in opposite to give me 10. Then a list, and you see on the slide the order changes a bit here, so I'm not really in order here, but you know, order is for people. I consider myself an artist, so let's continue with the list then. So I can provide a list of options, a choice. For instance, with my number of rows I want to display on a page, I can say, do you want a 5, 10, 15 or 20, and let's give this as an option. And then finally a free text entry where I allow them just to provide a text entry for whatever use case that is. If it's the end user license key that I talked about that the user would specify here, or if it's a server configuration. Now, this all goes into the settings, and then you save your work, and when you run the application, and here I have an iOS screenshot, then you see the dialog, or actually the preference panel that you created during design time at runtime, added under the name of the application in the settings of iOS. And then you see the mapping between what I defined and what iOS shows. And I can then, of course, work with these settings and just drill down on another page, see different options, and select one of the options and get to the list of choices that I provided in this configuration. The same on an Android device. Here using the emulator, but it looks the same on the device. The difference here is that though you see the same settings, they're located differently. Well, as an Android user, you know where your menus are, right? But for those that are working with iOS, just to mention, iOS has a central point for all of the preferences. Android lists them for the application itself. So you have to click on a menu icon and then it slides up the preferences as you see it here. So this is on the application level that you can work with. Now the same functionality is provided on Android as on iOS, so no surprise here. So you have pages, you have list items, you can work with all of these. Feature preferences is the second thing to talk about, and this goes back into architecturing mobile applications in MAF. Now reusable units, that's features, right? So it's a key element, and we can't stress it enough that when you design mobile applications you should think feature and functionality and not just trying to go for a monolithic approach. So having preferences on the application level really makes sense for preferences that are required within all features, like you could have a preference about what's the maximum number of rows to show for a query independent of what the query is. That belongs to the application level, or you want to have feature specific preferences. Now these feature specific preferences would then actually play into the use case that you're modeling within the feature. Now preference for each feature, if you define that, then of course the scope of that feature is accessible to, or the scope of that preference is accessible to that feature only. However, as you will see, they are added to the same settings, the same preferences menu as the global preference settings or the application-wide application settings. The design is similar to what I showed you about application settings and preferences. It's just a different file. It's the MAF feature.xml file where you select a feature, and this MAF feature XML file might have many features. You select a feature, and then you also have a preference option, a preference tab to work with, and this preference tab, the same working steps, the same elements you deal with declaratively allows you to create preferences for the feature. Now why is it in the feature XML file, not on the application XML file? Well, I already told you that. It's for reuse, because the feature XML file will go with the deployed features. If you use a feature archive for reuse, then that functionality and that information would now go with the MAF feature XML file and is available then to an application. And then it shows exactly the same in the settings. You wouldn't tell as an end user what of the settings come from the application level and what comes from the feature level. And again, exactly what I'm modeling a design team shows at runtime. How to access the feature? Well, that's now the preferences, not the feature, the preferences in the feature or the preferences from the application. Now that is the key point, because otherwise you wouldn't make any good use out of it. First of all, you have two options. One is to use expression language, which typically is what you would use on the user interface, and you can use Java as well, which typically is what you can use within your application logic, especially when it comes to how many data do you want to query, then that is something that you need to access from Java. The scheme for accessing preferences is dependent on whether you're accessing global application-wide preferences or if you want to access feature preferences. Now, for the application-wide preferences, the expression language scheme that you use will be hash, curly brace open, preference scope, and then the keyword application followed by the preference ID. And I mentioned that when you design preferences, you specify IDs. Now these IDs that could be dot-notated strings, that is what you have to append here. The feature preference is a little bit different in the schema that you would use to compose the expression language string, and that is that you have a hashtag as before, preference scope, but then the keyword is feature, and then it's followed by the feature ID. Now the feature ID also could be a dot delimited string, and after the feature ID you have the preference ID. And here definitely you want to be very sensitive and sensible about how long you want to define it, because always keep in mind you have to define unique feature names, you have to define unique preferences within that feature. Now if you overdo that, you end up with very long strings, which could be very cumbersome to work with, especially if later on you have to access all of this information from Java. So in the Java access, well, the Java access is through expression language. We mentioned in a previous recording already the Java utility class that MAF provides, ADF MAF Java utilities, and this allows you to evaluate expression language from within Java. And we use the same technique now to access user preferences either on the application level or on the feature level. Again, the same expression language schema applies here, and you just use it from Java. So here is an expression language example that I use the expression language builder for. Though I showed you the expression language schema, it doesn't mean that you have to know it by heart. So we give you guidance within JDeveloper, and this guidance is the expression builder. So on the expression builder, what you can do is you go to a property of a component that you want to influence with a preference. That could be a rendered option, or that could be a row fetch size option. And then there is an icon to the right of the property where you click on that, and it will launch the expression language builder. And this expression language builder has a preference scope, and if you expand this preference scope, then you see that there is a node for application and for feature. Now within the feature that you develop, you now have access to application preferences and to feature preferences. Of course, you have access to application features if the feature is developed in the context of the application. If that is a feature that you make reuse or reusable, then of course most likely when you develop the feature it's not in the same environment, and thus might not have visibility to the application features. However, as a design criteria in your development organization, you could mimic that. You can say, okay, we assemble our applications in a final application where all of the features go into, and this final application has this set of must-have preferences anyway. So these are our general corporate-wide standards for preferences. So in this case, you can just add this even when you develop individual features to the workspace that you develop the feature in, and you have this available. So you have the two categories there, application and feature, and then if you expand the node, it will just show you the groups, and it will show you the items in the group, so you can access these and compose the expression language. Up here, and up to here, I should say, we talked about preferences. Now I'm switching topic slightly a bit. Being very tolerant in saying that preferences are part of device integration. I'm not tolerant in saying that a shared property is a preference. Now, the idea here is that you want to share state information between features. Now, when we talk about features in MAF, then we talk about individual functionality. We talk of unit of works. And actually they're isolated. So that is a data control instance of one feature is not accessible on another feature. However, there might be a situation where you say, okay, a selection in one feature should have an impact on the behavior of another feature as soon as I navigate into it. And the use case I put here is where I do have a feature that is a customer management feature, and I do have an order entry feature. Now what I want to do is that when an employee works with my application and they select a customer and then navigate to the order entry feature, I want them to see the orders for that customer. And for this I need to share that information going across the feature. Similar, I could say, okay, if at runtime a user decides that they always want to see 10 records for whatever query they do in whatever feature, I can even have this information saved away in a scope that is available to all of the features. And then when I navigate from one feature to the other, I want to just read that information and make sure that one setting in one feature rules the other settings as well. And then we have application-wide runtime settings like information that users obtain from a REST service call. So you might have remote user preferences where they specify what are the runtime preferences for a specific application. Now, the beauty of having this kind of remote preferences is that they of course work across devices, across application. And so that is why they're stored remotely. However, keep in mind that if you use that approach here, then you need to have an online connection. Whereas the preferences I talked first about, application and feature level, they are there even for offline support. So here's a architectural image of how this works. So I have a task flow defined, feature 1, feature 2. I created AMIX features out of a task flow. And how do I get the communication going between the two sides here? Well, looking into the feature, it's an AMIX feature and the task flow exposed as a feature. I have an AMIX page and I do have a managed bean defined on the task flow. And the same is what I do on a second feature. Now what I could do is I could now have another managed bean defined in the unbounded task flow. If I put this managed bean into application scope, whereas the beans that are sitting in the feature are in a page flow scope or in a view scope, then I can access from these local managed beans the managed bean application scope and share information. I recommend not directly reach out to the application scope, just keep that level of isolation by having a local managed bean, because that from an architectural perspective not only feels better, it's better and it proves to be more solid when you continue developing an application, especially in teams. So this concludes the device integration recording series for the mobile application framework YouTube channel, and I hope I see you on the next recording.